Chapter 1 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scotty Smith. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. Chapter 1. The Tocsin of Revolt. 1. When a man finds himself at last slowly climbing the slopes which lead to the lonely peak of 70, he is likely to discover that his views and his aspirations are not in accord with those held by men still living leisurely in the foothills of youth. He sees that things are no longer what they were half-century earlier, and that they are not now tending in the direction to which they then pointed. If he is wise, he warns himself against the danger of becoming a mere praiser of past times, and if he is very wise, he makes every effort to understand and to appreciate the present, and not to dread the future. He may even wonder whether he is not suffering from a premature hardening of the arteries of sympathy. He finds himself denounced as a reactionary, and he doubts whether he has the courage of his reactions. He cannot but be aware that his case has little novelty, since a generation can never understand and appreciate the generation which preceded it or that which follows it. It can sympathize with the former a little better than with the latter, because we can know our parents more intimately than we can know our children after they have once attained to man's estate. Moreover, time has already chosen and consecrated the chief figures of the generation which preceded ours, and the effulgence of these outstanding personalities casts into the shade the failures of their time, whereas in the generation which follows ours, the leaders have not yet been elected, and the standard-bearers have not yet been able to manifest themselves fully, and to separate themselves from the failures, the freaks, and the fakes, who are as frequent and as insistently visible in one epoch as in another. The sexagenarian also perceives that the very young, who are vociferous in indiscriminate laudation of their contemporaries, are not at all anxious that he should understand them and appreciate their enthusiasms. They do not greatly care for his sympathy, or rather, they care not at all. In the inelastic intolerance and in the self-sufficient complacency of youth, they refuse to waste their attention on him. They have no use for him, as they would phrase it. They dismiss him as a back number than which there can be no object more despicable in their eyes. If they deemed it to be worth while, they might even cry out, "Go up, thou bald head!" And they would utter this insult without any fear of ursine retort. They are self-centered and impatient of control. They are inclined to boast themselves as the foes of tradition and as the enemies of convention. They claim a large freedom for themselves, and, like the Puritans of old, they are prone to deny a like freedom to others. Their opinions may be half-baked, but their prejudices are case-hardened. They see no reason to suspect that there may be interstices in their omniscience. They feel assured in their juvenile energy that they know it all, and they are not yet old enough to have found out that the man who knows it all does not know much, does not indeed know himself, which is the beginning of knowledge. In their callow immaturity they would only sniff contemptuously if they happened to hear the oft-quoted saying of the Master of Trinity that we are none of us infallible, not even the youngest of us. They may dispute among themselves incessantly and vehemently and bitterly, but they present a united front in opposition to their elders and betters, their pastors and masters. And these elders, if they have acquired a little of the wisdom which is the privilege of age, must recognize that this is natural enough, in fact inevitable, since it is what the elders did themselves when they had the fleeting joy of being young and of feeling the consciousness of their own untested powers. It is only by action and by reaction that the world moves. Every generation is entitled to prove all things, even if it is also bound to hold fast to that which is good. Every generation transmits to its successor the heterogeny of traditions and of conventions which it found useful and which it therefore esteems precious. Some of these are as valuable as those who established them believe, but others will not withstand the acid test on the touchstone of time. Oncoming youth must be free to select the traditions which are permanently useful and the conventions which need to be preserved. It is free also to make traditions of its own and to set up conventions more in accord with its own conditions. Without conventions of some sort, the work of the world cannot be done, as youth always finds out sooner or later when it seeks to abolish those which it has taken over. There is veracity as well as piquancy in the statement of a forgotten biographer that his hero renounced the errors of the Church of Rome and adopted those of the Church of England. The perfervid romanticists of France in 1830 devoted themselves to disestablishing the outworn conventions of the classicist drama. They accomplished their purpose, but all unwittingly they were merely substituting the conventions of their own romanticist theater, which the later naturalists denounce as pitiably invalid as those which the romanticists had discarded and destroyed. Already we are beginning to perceive that the naturalists had perforce to employ their own conventions, which seem to us now as unacceptable as those of the classicists and of the romanticists. It is recorded that in the fiercest moment of the fight of the romanticists against the classicists, a play by the elder Dumas was triumphantly successful at the Odeon, and in the exuberance of their delight, a group of more ardent spirits joined hands and danced around the bust of Racine in the lobby of the theater, crying, "It's all up with you, Racine! Enfoncez Racine!" And for the moment at least, they seemed to be justified in their joy. But within a score of years the genius of Rachel illuminated the masterpieces of both Racine and Corneille, and they were as triumphantly successful in their turn as the play of Dumas had been at its first performance. Moreover, when Racine again came into his own, the play of Dumas was already forgotten. Perhaps there is a lesson here for the intolerant iconoclasts of today. It may be that some of the reputations they are now annihilating will reveal themselves as solidly rooted as that of Racine. 2. The conflict between youth and age, between conservatism and radicalism, is unending, because it is eternally necessary to the vitality of the several arts, which need to be reinvigorated generation after generation. Youth will always lack deference for age. Inexperience will always try to throw off the shackles whereby experience seeks to restrain its energy. In fact, the conflict between youth and age is an ever-recurring skirmish in the everlasting battle between the individual and society as a whole. Ever since man came down from his tree in the forest primeval, ever since he emerged from the cave which was his home and his castle, he has had to curb his own desires for the benefit of the community of which he has become a part. His family, his clan, his tribe, his city, his state, his nation, even mankind call upon him continually for self-restraint, for the control of his passions, for self-sacrifice in view of a larger good. He must perforce part with his right to do absolutely as he pleases, or there would be immediate anarchy. But he must not yield all of it, or too much of it, or there would be despotism, either autocratic or aristocratic, democratic or socialistic. It is upon the social bond that the solidity of civilization depends, and also the freedom of the individual by which alone is civilization advanced. The social bond must be neither unduly tightened nor unduly relaxed. Torquemada was the type which is likely to be evolved when the social organization assumes to itself a total control of the individual. And Cain was an early example of the type which rejects all restraint and asserts a man's right to live as he himself may will, regardless of the rights and of the lives of others. The consequences of excessive individualism were revealed in the outrages of the closing days of the Paris Commune, and the consequence of the excessive subordination of the subject to the state were displayed when Germans, who may have been good husbands and devoted parents, sent to destruction the wives and children on the Lusitania. These are extreme manifestations of the two hostile principles which govern and always have governed and always must govern man, deciding what manner of life he shall lead and what kind of creature he shall be. Both principles are necessary. Both must be kept active, and neither must be allowed to master the other. It is as true today as it was when Horace made the assertion that safety lies in the middle of the road. The path to progress can be kept clear only when the opposing forces are in a state of unstable equilibrium, now swerved to one side by the onset of youth, and now swung to the other by the sturdy resistance of age. But at the present moment, and perhaps more especially in our own country, there are signs of danger. The pendulum is not at rest, and it seems to be swinging a little too far toward overt individualism. If this is the fact, then it is the immediate duty of the elders to point out the peril and to rally to the support of law and order. Possibly, indeed, very probably, what we perceive may be only a temporary symptom due to the excessive exuberance of youthful energy. The menace may pass away unfulfilled, as it has so often in the earlier centuries. The oncoming generation may awaken in time to a full recognition of the truth contained in George Eliot's assertion that the right to rebellion is the right to seek a higher rule and not to wander in lawlessness. Yet indisputably there is today much that is disquieting. There is not a little evidence of a tendency on the part of the young to refuse allegiance to the social bond, to reject the heritage of the past, to renounce tradition, and to insist upon the insubordinate manifestation of the caprices and vagaries of the untamed and undisciplined individual. We can only trust that the evidence is not as significant as it seems, for that way lies madness. Yet in life, in literature, in all the arts we cannot fail to perceive an unwonted restlessness, an unprecedented distaste for balance and harmony and proportion, accompanied by a desire to be different, by a seeking for novelty for its own sake, by a relish for eccentricity and freakishness, by a refusal to profit by what has been bequeathed to us by the past. In this new century, we have been called upon to admire painting by men who have never learnt how to paint, dancing by women who have never learnt how to dance, verse by persons of both sexes who have never acquired the elements of versification. The Tocsin of Revolt resounds in ethics as wantonly as in aesthetics. In our recent poetry, in our recent fiction, in our recent drama, there is an exaltation of the lawless and the illegal, the illicit and the illegitimate. The red flag has been unfurled over the heads of a mob of fiery youths who are insistent in proclaiming their rights and who seem to be careless about fulfilling their duties. A host of young fellows are pushing forward with their attention fixed only on themselves, selfish, egotistic, and boastful. Apparently they are possessed by the belief that they can make a clean sweep of the past, and that they can reach to the sky and touch the stars without standing on the shoulders of their predecessors, and without profiting by the achievements of these predecessors. 3. Probably this restless movement will soon spend its force as those who are directing it grow older and wiser. Probably the most it can achieve will be only the destruction of inheritances no longer valuable. Yet it may be as well for us to remind ourselves that there has never been any solid advance in any of the arts by any generation, except when that generation began where the immediately preceding generation left off. The future must build upon the past. Nothing is more hopelessly futile than the attempt to start fresh. To believe that this can ever be done is to ignore or to be ignorant of history. Progress can be made, not by disregarding what has already been discovered and invented, but only by knowing all these things, by absorbing them, by assimilating them, by combining them if need be, and by adding discoveries and new inventions. There is a phrase in constant use among the electrical engineers which is pertinent and illuminating. They are in the habit of speaking of the present state of the art, asserting that certain improvements, greatly to be wished for, are not possible in the present state of the art. And it is with the present state of the art as a starting point that they are prepared for the desired advance. In other words, before attempting to go forward, they make sure that they have mastered the technique of their profession and that they know all that has been done and know how it has been done, so that they can prepare themselves to do something which has never been done before. Not a few of those who are in the forefront of the modern movement are apparently full of contempt for the present state of the special art they propose to practice. They affect to despise technique, although every great artist has always delighted in technical accomplishment. We find in the work of many of these professed innovators an amazing slovenliness of craftsmanship, an appalling disdain for artistry for its own sake. If they were more familiar with the work of the men who have led the artistic revolutions of the past, they would know that these leaders always began by being abreast of the state of the art and by equipping themselves with all the varied and delicate tools devised by the craftsmen who had gone before. Victor Hugo, for example, revolutionized French poetry. He was profoundly dissatisfied with the restrictions then imposed upon the lyric and the drama by the rigidity of the accepted rules. But he was successful in his onslaught on an enfeebled tradition and on a false convention only because he was a supreme master of technique, dexterous beyond all men of his time, possessed of all the secrets of the art of verse. Ibsen, again, was a most potent force. He was responsible for a revival of intellectual interest in the drama, and he too was the most adroit of technicians, the most consummate of craftsmen, finding his profit in the work of the ingenious French playwrights of the middle of the 19th century. No doubt he bettered what he had learned from these Frenchmen, but he had to learn it first of all. He had to acquaint himself with the state of the art as it was when he began to compose his series of social dramas. So closely does he follow in the footsteps of the French that The League of Youth and The Pillars of Society, and even the first two acts of A Doll's House, might have been written by a Scandinavian Sardou. To many Americans, especially to the untraveled, the Russian ballet brought a new revelation of beauty. It was hailed as an absolute novelty, whereas in fact it represented only the latest stage of a long development of the pantomimic dance, first elaborated by Weir in Paris in the 18th century, and in the next 100 years carried from Paris to Milan and Naples, to Vienna, and finally to Petrograd. The dancing of Pavlova and the Mordkin was freshly individual, but only by that individuality did it differ from the dancing of Taglioni and Vestris. The mood might be Russian, but the method was Franco-Italian. One of the graceless pretenders who posture to symphonies and interpret poems by gesture alone once curtly dismissed Pavlova's exquisite grace as toe dancing. This was a characteristic exhibition of egotistic ignorance. The gracile Russian can dance on her toes, of course, because the ability to do that is an essential part of the necessary technique. But not because she can dance on her toes is it that Pavlova is a haunting vision of floating ethereality. In music, that most modern of the moderns, Debussy, made himself intimate with all the intricacies of harmony before he ventured upon his own disquieting innovations. In sculpture, that most modern of the moderns, Rodin, proved himself in his early bust of Puvis de Chauvin to be capable of a delicate refinement of modeling, recalling that of the masters of the Italian Renaissance. And his later works, which may appear to the careless observer as uncouthly hewn, disclose to the careful expert the unconscious skill of the modeling hand, to use George Eliot's apt phrase. And finally, in stage decoration, that most modern of the moderns, Joseph Urban, had long years of practice as an architect, making himself familiar with all the principles of that art, and so prepared himself arduously for the task that he was later to undertake. 4. Before they were ready to risk themselves in the quest for novelty, for a purely personal expression, Hugo and Ibsen, Debussy, Rodin, and Urban made sure that they were abreast of the state of the art. They had subjected themselves to discipline and submitted to training. Only because they did this in their youth were they able in their maturity to express themselves adequately and interestingly, and to advance the state of the art. And this discipline and this training is just what a crowd of clever youngsters now affect to despise, possibly from sheer laziness, but more probably from a sincere conviction that these things are no longer necessary and indeed no longer useful. They seem to believe honestly that the future masterpieces of literature and of art are to be evolved out of their inner consciousness by some sort of spontaneous generation. They have persuaded themselves that art is as easy as it looks, and that a mastery of its processes is the gift of God, freely granted to those who are conscious of possessing the artistic temperament. In fact, this belief is not infrequently expressed with unsuspected frankness. One of the most distinguished of American mural painters was recently advising an ambitious young fellow from the West, who listened to the counsel courteously and rejected it absolutely. "No," he said, "the school of Rome is not for me, and these art schools of New York are not for me. I have ideas of my own. I consider my temperament the most valuable asset, and I'm not going to submit to its being interfered with by any rules." It would be futile, of course, to call the attention of these self-centered youngsters to Goethe's pungent epigram, which Austin Dobson aptly turned into English. Saith one, "To no school I belong, no living master leads me wrong, nor do I, for the things I know, a debt to any dead man owe." Which means, in phrasing less polite, I am a fool in my own right. Is this attitude the result of impatience, or of laziness, or of inordinate conceit? One acute observer of contemporary conditions has suggested that it is due to the leveling tendency of modern life, so that men strive frantically to raise themselves above the level by doing something strange, startling, exaggerated, whimsical. To study the laws and methods of literature or the arts, to saturate themselves with traditions, bores them. So they resort to sensationalism and try to palm it off for originality. Of course, any of them could achieve a similar originality by coming naked up Fifth Avenue. Indeed, there are recent poems and recent pictures which are instantly recognizable as indecent exposures of the nudity of their producers' minds. It is not difficult to diagnose this green sickness of the arts, but it is hard to prescribe any remedy. The tendency to anarchy, to uneducated individualism, may be evident in all arts and in all countries, but nonetheless it is certainly to subside, because if it persisted too long the several arts would cease to be, and that is inconceivable, since man needs them all, and has developed them in response to his needs. The malady must run its course, and in spite of the expectant treatment of the mature practitioners, the young patients will come out of the attack temporarily enfeebled. Perhaps the fever will soon be shaken off by the stronger and the soberer, better able to resist the infection. When Richard Wagner, who was once denounced as a dangerous innovator, was a youthful student, he did not like the drudgery of counterpoint. But his instructor, Theodor Weinlig, made him work hard at it for 6 months, dismissing him with the remark, "What you have learnt is freedom." And it was this laboriously acquired liberty within the law which enabled Wagner, in the prelude to the Master Singers, to work simultaneously in counterpoint 5 of his leading motives. Once again, it is helpful to quote, in Austin Dobson's rendering, Théophile Gautrier's Art Vitry. Yes, when the ways oppose, when the hard means rebel, fairer the work outgrows, more potent far the spell. O poet, then, forbear the loosely sandaled verse, choose rather thou to wear the buskin straight and terse. Leave to the tyro's hand the limp and shapeless style, see that thy form demand the labor of the file. Sooner or later the tocsin of revolt will cease its clangor. Sooner or later the young men of promise will furl the red flag. They will refuse to fellowship with the fakers. They will tire of facile eccentricity and of lazy freakishness, of unprofitable sensationalism and of undisciplined individualism. They will again seek the aid of tradition, and they will toil to master the secrets of technique. They will recognize the validity of Theodore Roosevelt's shrewd saying, "Second-rate work is always second-rate, even if it is badly done." Then, and then only, will they discover the stern and abiding joy of difficulty resolutely grappled with and ultimately conquered. 1917. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Grenholm. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. The Duty of the Intellectuals. Roman 1. The French, always keen in classification and apt in nomenclature, have devised a special designation for the men of light and leading, who are indisputably influential in the community, yet who rarely descend into the arena of practical politics. These artists and these philosophers, these men of letters and these men of science, figures of national importance, the French are wont to group together and to call them collectively the intellectuals. Corresponding groups exist in every other country, of course, even if their solidarity and their significance is nowhere else as fully recognized as it is in France. And in every people these intellectuals may be summoned for service to the state. They may have imposed upon them, suddenly, a duty not possible of performance by any other group. When Matthew Arnold paid his first visit to the United States, now 35 years ago, he prepared an opening lecture specially for us, choosing for it a topic from which he could deduce a moral of immediate and permanent importance to those he was directly addressing. He called his discourse Numbers, or the Remnant, and with characteristic courage he warned us that the voice of the people is not to be received everywhere and always as the voice of God. He insisted on the duty laid upon the more thoughtful and the better informed to combat any tendency toward a blind yielding to the pressure of the more ignorant majority. He dwelt upon the supreme significance of a saving remnant of the most intelligent and of the most upright, ready always to resist the momentary unanimity of the mob, and capable of holding fast to ancient landmarks, no matter how high and how fierce the tide which might seem to be about to batter them down and to sweep them away. Of course, Arnold was far too shrewd to be tempted to the opposite extreme, and to hold with Ibsen that the majority is always in the wrong. The persuasive British critic had derived from his study of French life and French literature not a little of the social instinct of the French, ever a corrective of the excessive individualism which invalidates the preaching of the stern and egotistic Scandinavian dramatist. The majority is not always in the wrong, and the minority is not always in the right. Yet the multitude is inclined to have fleeting fits of hysteria, and it is then in danger of rushing down a steep place and casting itself into the sea, unless it is recalled to its self-possession by the voice of the few who have kept their self-control. Arnold quoted a pertinent passage from Plato, describing the plight of a people which is deprived of this element of stability. There is but a very small remnant of honest followers of wisdom, and they are those who have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession is wisdom, and who can fully see, moreover, the madness of the multitude, and that there is no one, we may say, whose action in public matters is sound, and no ally for whosoever would help the just. What are they to do? The same point was made more recently, and with a more direct reference to conditions often occurring in a modern democracy, by Professor George Burton Adams in his Phi Beta Kappa address at Columbia University in the spring of 1917. For it often happens in the history of democracies that the man who stands in the place of leadership, whose duty it is from his position to point out the way upon which the nation ought to enter, chooses rather to wait until the general opinion makes itself known. When this happens, the duty falls with more than usual weight upon those men who can lead the opinion of their communities. And in every community like this, it is the privilege of the educated man. Sometimes the man who stands in the place of leadership, that is to say, the chief magistrate of the republic, is truly a leader, stalwart in maintaining his own convictions, and resolute in resisting the pressure of public opinion when he is convinced that it is being temporarily exerted in the wrong direction. In our own history we have seen many instances of this manly courage, which risked immediate unpopularity to secure an ultimate result beneficial to the whole community. Washington refused to yield to the clamor which insisted that we should again go to war with Great Britain. Grant vetoed the inflation bill, and Cleveland withstood the apparently irresistible demand for free silver. But there have been other moments in our history when the political leader of the hour has waited until general opinion made itself known, and when he has then made himself the mouthpiece and the instrument of the majority, even though he did not himself share its opinions. Of course, this is an abdication of the privileges of leadership, and it reduces the politician, conforming to this practice, to the contemptible position of the fabled French demagogue who was warned against following the mob, and who explained with frank ingenuousness, "But I must follow them. I am their leader." Roman 2. When the foremost officer in the state lacks the vision and the courage to stand up in behalf of the eternal principles endangered for the moment by the misdirected enthusiasm of the majority, then, as Professor Adams says, the duty of resisting the evil desire of the hours falls with more than usual weight upon those men who have it in them to be truly leaders, the men of education, of intellect, of intelligence. We are often told that a democracy like ours has no respect for what must be termed the aristocracy of intellect, and that this disrespect is proved by the absence of the members of this mentally superior group from the higher places in the government of the city, of the state, and of the nation. There is no denying that our intellectuals have not often held high positions in the public service. But this is not a condition peculiar to the United States in the 20th century. Only very rarely, in any period and in any place, have the foremost intellects of that time and of that country been engaged in the actual work of administration and legislation. It is true that Goethe did for a few years have a large share in the ruling of Little Weimar. It is true also that Caesar, Frederick, and Napoleon, Richelieu and Cromwell, Lincoln and Bismarck were all of them men of exceptional acumen and imagination. But it is not as intellectual chiefs that we remember them. Statesmen, however successful, are not likely to be advanced thinkers, pioneers of speculative inquiry, and they would not have been as successful in their own special field if they had been prone to the speculative inquiries which would have separated them in sympathy from the main body of the plain people whom it was their first duty to guide. As President Eliot once put it pithily, political leaders are very seldom leaders of thought. They are generally trying to induce masses of men to act on principles thought out long before. And their skill is in the selection of practicable approximations to their ideal. Their arts are arts of exposition and persuasion. Their honor comes from fidelity under trying circumstances to familiar principles. It is when these political leaders are derelict to duty and stain their hands by lack of fidelity to familiar principles that the intellectual aristocracy, the philosophers and the educators, the men of letters and the men of science, are under obligation to abandon their several studies for the moment, and to testify to the permanence of the familiar principles which are attacked by the majority and betrayed by its official leaders. It is then their duty to try to resist and to stabilize public opinion, as on other occasions and under other circumstances it is their duty to stimulate and to encourage it. A country is fortunate when the members of its intellectual aristocracy are conscious of this obligation and alive to the privilege it confers. And a country is singularly unfortunate when those who ought to be its chief spirits renounce their chieftainship, step down from their lofty isolation, and throw in their lot with the mob. Even when there is no emotional excitement in public affairs, the more calmly thinking class has the special function of reacting against the natural, national self-glorification, which may be useful when kept strictly within bounds, but which is dangerous, not to say deadly, when allowed to run riot. Every powerful and expanding people has a tendency to exalt itself, and to hold itself as indisputably superior to all its rivals. Sometimes this belief is so ingrained and deep-rooted and long-standing that it feels no need for overt expression. It expects to be taken for granted, even if unstated. And something of this attitude might have been seen toward the end of the 19th century, both in France and in England. Sometimes it is a sudden and violent reaction from previous self-depreciation. It is the swift result of a new national consciousness, and then it is likely to demand vehement proclamation, as though it were not quite sure of itself and needed to be convinced by the emphatic assertion of its supremacy. And something of this attitude was to be seen in Germany in the early years of the 20th century. Sometimes it was due not so much to actual achievement as to a sublime belief in the possible accomplishment of the future. And something of this attitude was observable in the boastfulness not infrequently heard in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Whatever the cause of this attitude, it calls for constant and vigilant self-criticism. Lowell, both in the verses of A Fable for Critics and in the prose of his essays, shot shafts of pungent wit into the inflated figure of Brother Jonathan, distended by self-puffery. And Matthew Arnold was untiring in protest against Macaulay's complacent assumption of British supremacy in literature. Of course, every great people possesses certain qualities in greater abundance than any of its rivals, and equally, of course, there are other qualities in which it is more or less deficient. Arnold, again, deserved well of his countrymen for the insistence with which he called attention to the French virtues of order and organization, harmony and proportion, qualities which he urged his more energetically imaginative countrymen to acquire from their hereditary rivals. Roman 3. It is, however, not so much in the hours of calm as in the days of national excitement that the influence of the intellectuals is most useful. When a people is about to be swept off its feet by hysteric emotionalism, then there is a burden laid upon the honest followers of wisdom and those who have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession is wisdom, and who can see, moreover, the madness of the multitude. A country is then fortunate indeed if its intellectuals measure up to their duty, and it is sadly bereft if they sink themselves in the mad multitude. Here in the United States, in the dark years after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, our intellectuals rose to the occasion and were insistent in asserting the iniquity of slavery and the plain right of every man to own himself. The influence of the lyrics of Whittier and of Lowell were direct, but it was probably not more potent than the indirect influence of Emerson's individualistic philosophy. In Great Britain in the 18th century, the intellectuals, always with the exception of Dr. Johnson, were almost united in opposing the folly of the American policy of George III. And in the 19th century, many of the intellectuals were not in favor of the Boer War, and the stand that they then took was one factor in bringing about a final settlement so liberal in its terms to the defeated party that it assured the lasting unity of the new South African Commonwealth. But it is in France that the intellectuals have had occasion to exert themselves most often and most effectively. France is fortunate in that she has never lacked men of vision and of courage willing to stand up to be counted, even if they had to stand alone. In the reign of Louis XV, sunk in lust and corruption, the frail Voltaire cried aloud in the wilderness for justice to Callus, and never desisted until the hideous wrong was righted, insofar as this might be. In the Second Empire of that shabby and shoddy adventurer, Napoleon III, Victor Hugo, the foremost figure in French literature, remained in voluntary exile and never ceased his protest against the usurper. And finally, in the Third Republic, when the iniquity against Dreyfus had been consummated, and when public opinion was overwhelming in favor of accepting the verdict of the military court as settling the question absolutely and forever, a little group of the intellectuals refused to take part in this conspiracy of silence. They declined to be satisfied with any solution of the difficulty which was a betrayal of justice. It was the famous letter of Émile Zola, I accuse, with its vigorous and vehement rhetoric, which rang forth as a clarion call to all those who held eternal right superior to temporary expediency. Nor was Zola alone in his attitude. Anatole France was not less resolute, and they were only two out of a host of the intellectuals. It is not often that a state is reduced to the pitiable condition depicted by Plato when its multitude is mad, and when there is no one whose action in public matters is sound. The saving remnant may be very small, its members may be very few, and yet it is able to manifest itself and to make itself heard, and to do what it can to counteract the contagion of hysteria which has captured the populace. It is not often that a nation is found to be without honest followers of wisdom. It is not often, but it does happen on occasion, and it has happened recently. In the second decade of this century, we had superabundant evidence that a great people had declined into this pitiable condition, despairingly described by Plato, a people whom we should have held to be almost immune from hysteria, a people whom we should have believed to be more than adequately provided with a saving remnant of men who have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession is wisdom. Roman 4. If there ever was a moment in the history of a great nation when it had imperative need for a clear-thinking minority, stalwart in the faith, however few in number, that moment arrived in Germany in the months which followed the outbreak of the war. Then, if ever, was the opportunity for the champions of German culture, for the intellectuals of Germany, for the saving remnant, to render to their country a service of incalculable value. It was their chance to do for Germany, in her hour of madness, what the intellectual leaders of France had done for their country in the fiery furor aroused by the Dreyfus affair. But there was not a single one of the high priests of German culture who had the courage to initiate the brave attitude of Zola when he flung, I accuse, in the face of those who were defending the indefensible wrong. Not only did the intellectuals of Germany fail to urge moderation upon their fellow subjects, and to use their influence to modify, as far as might be, the fierceness of popular feeling, stimulated by every possible governmental organization, but they allowed themselves to be cajoled or coerced into signing a manifesto of which the sole effect in Germany itself was to intensify the spirit of hate. It was less than 3 months after the military party had plunged Europe into war that 93 philosophers and artists, men of letters and men of science, sent forth their perfervid protest formally addressed to the civilized world, in which they denounced the lies and calumnies with which enemies are endeavoring to stain the honor of Germany in her hard struggle for existence, a struggle which has been forced upon her. We do not know who was the actual writer of this manifesto, with its declamatory rhetoric, but whoever he may have been, his fellow signers made themselves responsible for his series of denial of things which the civilized world knew to be facts. Very likely it was the result of collaboration of several writers, uniting their efforts to make their unfounded assertions the more emphatic. They borrowed the device of repeating their negative, "It is not true," from the affirmative, I accuse, of Zola's noble letter. But where the Frenchman had stood up alone in defense of what he believed to be right, and in defiance of what seemed to be the overwhelming opinion of his fellow citizens, the German intellectuals enrolled themselves in a company of nearly 100 to lend the weight of their reputations to a series of assertions which the majority of them ought to have known to be unfounded and false. It is not true, so they asserted, that the Germans were guilty of causing the war, that they had trespassed in neutral Belgium, that they had wantonly destroyed Louvain, that their warfare had violated international law, and that it was possible to make a distinction between German militarism and German civilization. And they ended their appeal to the civilized world with this demand: have faith in us. Believe that we shall carry on this war to the end as a civilized nation to whom the legacy of a Goethe, a Beethoven, and a Kant is just as sacred as its own hearths and homes. This last paragraph may have been meant either as a prophecy or as a promise, and in either case it has lamentably failed of performance. What would Goethe and Beethoven and Kant have thought of the sinking of the Lusitania, of the massacre of the Armenians, of the deportation of the Belgians, and of the murder of women and children by bombs dropped from Zeppelins upon unfortified towns? Yet to this protest the signers pledged their names and their honor, and these signers bore the most honorable names in Germany, many of them enjoying a worldwide reputation. Among them were Brandl, Dorpfeld, Eucken, Fulda, Haeckel, Harnack, Hauptmann, Humperdinck, Ostwald, Rentgen, Sudermann, Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, and Wundt. Perhaps it is only fair to apportion the blame between the artists and the scientists, and to relieve the former of a little of the odium which the latter cannot escape. The men of letters, the dramatists, the musicians, may perhaps be a little more excusable for surrendering to the emotion of the moment, since their art is impossible without abundant feeling. Artists must possess emotion, even if they ought also to be dowered with intelligence. But what might be excused in men of letters is inexcusable in men of science, who do not need emotion, and whose function is to know, and to know with absolute precision. It is the immitigable duty of the scientist to suppress his personal equation, to see the thing as it really is, and to report on it without exaggeration or diminution, and to assert nothing that he cannot prove. But here we find the chief German scientists, historians, and physicists alike making solemn asseverations about things which they had not scientifically investigated, and as to which they had no secure knowledge. Their desertion dealt a death blow to the reputation of German science, and this reputation was not wounded in the house of its enemies, it was assassinated by its friends. It may be argued that these German intellectuals made a superb self-sacrifice when they pledged their names and their honor to reckless misstatements, and that they merely proffered their reputations as the German soldiers were risking their lives. If this was the motive of any of them, as it may very well have been, the sacrifice was in vain. When the Roman Curtius plunged into the fiery gulf, he knew in advance that his heroic deed would cause the gaping earth to close. But when these German intellectuals flung their names and their honor into the chasm, it yawned only the wider. Here is one obvious explanation of the pitiful plight in which Germany found herself a little later, without a single friend except her vassal allies, and with the civilized world in arms against her. Her intellectuals failed her in her hour of need. They did not stand forth as honest followers of wisdom. They allowed themselves to be drafted by the military machine, as docilely as the cannon fodder in the ranks of the regiments that invaded Belgium. And their dereliction from their duty dates further back to the days long before the war, when they made no effort, singly or collectively, to counteract the insidious megalomania which was dominating Germany. They did not combat this boastfulness. They took part in it. They led the shouting and the tumult of self-praise. They therefore abdicated their leadership, and we need not wonder that when this megalomania resulted in war, they banded themselves together to intensify the madness of the multitude. These German leaders might be intellectual, but they were not intelligent. They might be professors of psychology, but they had little knowledge of human nature. They might be poets and playwrights, but they were deficient in understanding of the human heart. They were convinced, and they aided in convincing the populace, that the Germans were the chosen people, that they were the salt of the earth, that they were the elect of God, that they were supreme in all the arts and in all the sciences. Holding these convictions, there was not one German intellectual who was prepared to play the part of a Voltaire or a Hugo, a Lowell or an Arnold, and to reiterate the unwelcome truths that a people needs to hear from its leaders. Even in the years of peace, they had little self-respecting independence, and when war broke in all its horror, they were unresistingly dragooned into the sacrifice of their reputations, their honor, and the honor of German science. 1917. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Gary Grenholm.
Chapter 3 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan R. Tate, Bedford, Massachusetts. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews, Chapter 3. I once asked an architectural critic what he thought of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and he shrugged his shoulders as he answered that it was blameless. It possesses everything that a Gothic cathedral ought to have except life. In fact, it can fairly be described as the definition of a Gothic cathedral. That is to say, it is a servile transcription, devoid of the freedom and the spontaneity, the originality and the individuality, which are the essential characteristics of the noble edifices it pretended to emulate. It is a translation, made by a man of ability, no doubt, but by a man who did not think in terms of Gothic art. I do not venture even to guess what may have been my artistic friend's opinion of a French Renaissance house which occupies a prominent position on the Riverside Drive. It is an uninspired conglomerate of several of the superb chateaux on the Loire, cabin-cribbed and confined in a single city block of 2 or 3 acres. It stands revealed as a Slavish transcript, without grace or charm or power. On the banks of the Loire it would be a poor thing, and on the banks of the Hudson it is a barren absurdity, out of place and out of time, a stark confession of architectural impotence. Nor have I dared to inquire what my friend thought about a Tudor manor house which is conspicuous at Newport. It has been vaulted as a triumphant effort to recapture the Elizabethan largeness, and it might have seemed more attractive if it had been planted in the center of a spacious park, if it rose from stately terraces with century-old turf, and if it were approached by winding drives arched over by century-old oaks. But it is pitiably circumscribed in a scant half-dozen acres, in close proximity to a host of other country places, many of them quite as out of keeping with the American climate and with American conditions. Since England is a land of cloudy skies and of frequent rain, an imitation of an Elizabethan dwelling could not have the sheltering verandas essential in the bold sunshine of our hot American summers. The Tudor mansions which this American dwelling aped had been properly adjusted to the climatic conditions of the British Isles, very northerly and made habitable only by the warmth of the Gulf Stream. Moreover, if an Elizabethan residence is to be reproduced honestly, the American imitation must forego not only the veranda but also the carpets in the bathrooms, unknown to the subjects of the Virgin Queen, who are accustomed to the strewing of their floors with rushes and to the free and frequent use of perfumes instead of bathing. To build a Gothic cathedral over here, or a French chateau or an Elizabethan manor house, is akin to renouncing the use of our own language, as it is spoken in our own time and in our own country. It is an attempt, foredoomed to failure, to speak a tongue not our own, the grammar of which has been acquired painfully and the idioms of which have to be apprehended as best we can. It is not unlike the unfortunate effort to write Greek plays in English, a vain attempt to tell a story on the stage not in accord with the conditions of our snug 20th century playhouses, roofed and lighted, but in conformity with what we believe we know about the conditions of the theater of Dionysus, several centuries before the Christian era, an immense open-air amphitheater, stageless and sceneryless. It is a matter of common knowledge that the best Greek plays were written by the Greeks themselves, and they were satisfied with their own methods of dramatic composition and did not shackle themselves by deference to any models which may have existed in earlier and alien civilizations. So the noblest Gothic cathedrals were erected by those to whom Gothic was vernacular. The finest French chateaux were constructed by the French themselves in the spacious days of the Renaissance, and the stateliest Elizabethan mansions were built by the Elizabethans. If there is no hope of surpassing or even equaling the originals, why should we waste our energies in the futile endeavor to imitate the inimitable? After all, there are advantages in being your own contemporary and your own fellow citizen, and Charles Lamb was not to be taken seriously when he cried, "Hang the age! I'll write for antiquity." Although he had nourished his style by loving study of his literary ancestors, the essays of Delia are not written in Wardour Street English. There is the same unreality about all these architecture echoings that there is about the historical novel, with its inevitable unsuccessful struggle to recapture the spirit of the past and with its equally unavoidable anachronisms. No one of us by taking thought can step off his own shadow, and no one of us can ever hope to put his clock back to any departed century. It is impossible to dispossess ourselves of our accretions of knowledge and not to credit to the past more or less of the wisdom of the present. The fundamental falsity of the historical novel was never more flagrantly disclosed than in the German tale, wherein the soldier bade his wife farewell with the explanation that, "I am now leaving you for the 7 Years' War." The effort to reproduce the peculiarities of antiquity, as Mr. Santayana has asserted, is a proof that we are not its natural heirs, that we do not continue antiquity instinctively. People can mimic only what they have not absorbed. They reconstruct and turn into archaeological masquerade only what strikes them as outlandish. The genuine inheritors of a religion or an art never dream of reviving it. Its antique accidents do not interest them, and its eternal substance they possess by nature. Indefensible as is the endeavor to import architecture in the original package, it is not more absurd than the attempt to borrow decoration ready-made. In trying to transplant a French chateau or an English manor house, there is evident the desire to have at least a dwelling of a single style, however unoriginal it may be. But even more frequent of late in the United States than these homogeneous plagiarisms are the houses whose connecting rooms display a heterogeneity of disparate and discordant elements, each of them violently swearing at its neighbor. This is what is known as period furnishing and period decoration. A room rigidly reproducing the stiff severity of the French Empire will open into another hung with the tapestries and filled with the furniture of the reign of Louis XIV. And this in turn may lead to a third where the decoration is Adam and where the chairs are Chippendale. A Byzantine entrance may conduct a visitor to a Gothic hall on his way to a Louis XVI drawing room and to a George II dining room, opening out on a Spanish patio arranged as a conservatory or on an Egyptian tomb, forced in the service as a billiard room. The bedrooms may be Japanese or Chinese, Hindu or Persian, and the only American room in the house is likely to be the kitchen, unless perchance the headstrong owner has insisted on making this Pompeian or Assyrian. Could anything be less artistic than this inconsistent medley of periods and of places? Could anything be more like an architectural crazy quilt? Could anything be less homelike? How can anybody ever expect that his household gods will settle down comfortably in so piebald an environment? How can any 20th century American reconcile himself to taking up his residence in an atmosphere so alien and so unfriendly? How can he feel the warmth of his own hearth when he has condemned himself to dwell in the frigidity of a portfolio of sample plates? The most that the owner of a dwelling so motley can do is to pride himself on the accuracy of the imitations he has purchased and to be vain over his own absence of originality. There are those who hold that this devotion to the period room is the abomination of desolation, but who are inclined to be more tolerant toward another method of despoiling the alien past to the profit of the American present, the method applied with surpassing skill by the late Stanford White. He attempted no facile reproduction of the residence or the apartments of any one country or of any one epoch, but when he traveled in Europe he was ever on the lookout for the beautiful fittings of any of the eras when the art of the decorator was flourishing. He would purchase a superb marble mantelpiece in Florence, a splendidly elaborate pair of carved doors in Venice, a heavily beamed oak ceiling with the paneling which accompanied it in Prague, and tapestries and embroidered hangings, tables and chairs, sideboards and coffers, in whatever city he might visit. Then he designed a dwelling in a free adaptation of the formula of the palace of the Italian Renaissance, proportioning a room to receive the paneling in the ceiling he had ravished from Bohemia, and arranging the entrance hall so that it could be adorned by the marble mantelpiece and the carved doors of which he had despoiled Italy. There is no denying that this process of lordly conquest enabled him to achieve a captivating scrumptiousness. He had an instinctive understanding of the material means whereby he could get the utmost effect out of these accumulated spoils. He had taste and ingenuity, and he was a born decorator, a belated but not unworthy descendant of the many-sided artists of the Italian Renaissance. When he took the stalls of a 16th-century church hidden in one of the forlorn hill towns of Italy and transformed them adroitly into a bookcase for a 20th-century American residence, he was inspired so to provide all the other furnishings of the room that there would be a harmony of effect. The result did not correspond with any one period, and there was no desire for a pedantic consistency of style. A house designed and decorated by Stanford White was modern in its way, for all its utilization of a variety of antiques. It was always brilliant, and it was often beautiful in its luxurious richness of color and of pattern. And, strange to say, it was not altogether un-American in its flamboyant expansiveness, since America has arrogated the right to consider itself as the heir of the ages. Yet this incorporation of exotic elements into domestic decoration rarely arrived at complete assimilation, and now and again it stood confessed as little better than a litter of loot. Even when it was most successful, it was open to the charge that it was more or less an attempt to get fine art ready-made, and we are all aware that the ready-made rarely fits as well as the made-to-order. White's method was not in accord with the practice of the great decorators in the days when decoration was greatest. It can scarcely be accepted as a step forward in our progress to an American art which shall truly be our own. Modern architecture, so one of the foremost American architects once declared, should not be that of the illogical architect living in one age and choosing a style from another, whereby he is self-condemned to inferiority. And Mr. Hastings then pointed out that we are modern in our dress and would not think of wearing a Gothic robe or a Roman toga, but as individual as we might wish to be, we should still be inclined, with good taste, to dress according to the dictates of the day. He reminded us also that in each successive style in architecture and in decoration, there has always been a distinct spirit of contemporaneous life from which its root drew nourishment. And he outlined again the evolution of Roman architecture out of Greek, as the Latins demanded baths and bridges and basilicas, and in meeting these calls upon their craft, the Roman architects modified the Greek forms until there had been evolved out of Greek a Roman architecture, which was the result of the new exigencies of the Latins themselves. More than 1,000 years later, the demands of the people of Italy brought about another evolution, that of Roman architecture into Renaissance, a logical outgrowth which was attained only by the efforts of 3 generations of artists. The architecture of the Italian Renaissance had to be modified again to meet the different demands of the French when they had their Renaissance a little later, and it had to be modified once more to adjust itself to the needs of the people of England, where the climate and the ideals of life were very different from those of the French or of the Italians. Again there was an assimilation, an outgrowth, an evolution, until the result was English. Whistler might declare that Christopher Wren had robbed St. Peter's to build St. Paul's, but nonetheless is the English cathedral English in its birth, even if its ancestry is alien. In their Palladian buildings, the British were not so much borrowing the patterns of Palladio as they were continuing his tradition, conforming their practice to their own needs and their own desires. They scaled down the stately proportions of the palaces of the Italian princes to be commensurate with their own more modest necessities, and with little less of beauty the marble villa became the brick manor house. In due time, the tradition of the Queen Anne and George I architects was transplanted to this side of the Atlantic and adjusted in turn to our American climate and ideals of life, conforming itself to our needs and desires. So it was that our ancestors more or less modified the Georgian customs, and the result of their independent handling of their artistic heritage was the outgrowth which we have chosen to call colonial. But the men who were responsible for Independence Hall and for Mount Vernon were only building as best they knew how in accordance with the spirit of their own time and in obedience to its requirements. They never thought of style as something to be sought for second-hand, any more than the Italians had done in their day, or the Romans or the Greeks in theirs. In fact, the artists of a great period of architecture and decoration have never thought of style. They never felt that they had any liberty of choice, since neither they nor their contemporaries knew any other way to work. Nonetheless did they achieve an indigenous individuality, and it did not occur to them to make marauding raids upon a castle or church that had fallen on evil days, or to bind themselves to a microscopic fidelity to the models which had inspired them. These early American builders might use brick, imported from Holland or from England, or they might employ the timber of the primitive forest, in which case they had again to modify the method they were utilizing, all unconscious that their new departures were leading them more than a little way from the patterns of their immediate predecessors. They made ample fireplaces for the huge logs which alone could warm these residences in our long winters, and they thrust out verandas which alone could provide the shelters grateful in our scorching summers. They relied on shingles and clapboards in default of stone and slate, and they made all the other changes imposed by new conditions in a new world. They worked freely and spontaneously, each in his own fashion and each profiting by his own individuality. They were speaking the only language they knew, and because it was their vernacular, they were colloquially at ease with it, and on occasion it encouraged them to be eloquent. So long as the architect believes that art stopped short in the cultivated court of the Empress Josephine, and so long as the decorator is willing to be a bond slave to a period, unable to call his soul his own, just so long will their misguided imitation result in stagnation and sterility. Their art will resemble the mule in that it will have no pride of ancestry and no hope of posterity. It may also reveal another likeness to the mule, in that it is obstinate in refusing to go forward. A family whose residence is a decorative grab bag, even if the furniture consists only of museum pieces, must feel more or less as though it had taken up its abode in a curiosity shop, the atmosphere of which is chill and inhospitable. Such a dwelling must always remain icily impersonal. It cannot adapt itself to its occupants, as Lowell in one of his letters asserted that a home always did if it was truly a home. Its inmates can hardly help looking upon themselves as transients, restrained from capricious desertion by no clinging tentacles of affection for their own handiwork. They have had little or nothing to do with its making, and they need not care what becomes of it when they depart and surrender it to others who will be equally unable to take root. We have all of us our daydreams, and it is one of mine that if I were a multimillionaire, still in the prime of life and fortunate in a wife who was a helpmate, and in a half-dozen sons and daughters who might gather about the hearth of an evening, I would build a house for myself that should truly be a home, adapted to its occupants, made for us and no one else, fit for a family to grow up in and to leave with regret and to return to with unfailing joy. Moreover, it should be a dwelling at once contemporary and American, with nothing antique or imitated, and with nothing alien or exotic. It should be the product of America today, a genuine effort to represent our country and our time, an expression of the very best that an American architect could do with the aid of the foremost of our painters and our sculptors. If the house of my daydream could be completed according to this principle, it would be as absolutely native to us now as an Italian palace of the Renaissance was to its owner, and it would be as spontaneous an outgrowth of our contemporary civilization as was a chateau on the Loire or as a Tudor manor house, each in its own time and place. Its designer would not be thinking of his style, and he would not be straining himself in quest of overt originality, any more than did the designers of the palace, the chateau, or the manor house. The skyscraper is our sole architectural invention, the product of our own ingenuity and the result of our own necessity. And at first it was nothing but an artistic monstrosity, imposing only from its mighty mass, because our architects felt obliged to cramp it into a pattern suited only to buildings designed for wholly different purposes, and because they strove vainly to secure a satisfactory aesthetic effect by inappropriate ornament externally applied and only fortuitously related to the structure. At last they decided to eschew these adventurous disguises, and they are now able to achieve beauty by proportion and symmetry and by a frank recognition of the skyscraper's stark and masculine uplifting of itself in air. Probably it would not be possible to make the dwelling of my daydream as distinctively American as the skyscraper, but at least it need not be an empty copy of a palace or a chateau or a manor house. Of course, it would have to be a modification of the so-called colonial house, adapted by our ancestors in the days before the Revolution from the 18th century houses of the mother country. What we call colonial was borrowed from England as England had borrowed it originally from Italy, but we have made it our own in the course of 70 years and more. It is now vernacular. We speak it naturally. We think in it, and therefore we can use it without regard to any standard existing elsewhere, excepting always the abiding standards of fitness and taste. The house I have in my mind's eye might be of wood or of marble, but I like best to vision it as brick, ever a satisfying material for a home. It would have steel beams, unknown to our ancestors, because these permit the architect to get results difficult or impossible when he is limited to wood. It would be absolutely fireproof, again, of course, because I want it to survive as a home, generation after generation. It must be built by honest craftsmen, interested each of them in his work and each of them in doing his best for sheer joy in his job. The decorations, the hangings, the wallpapers, the lighting fixtures, the doorknobs, the fire irons, the furniture, the floor coverings, should all be American and contemporary, and since in my dream I have no need to consider the question of cost, these accompaniments, whenever they could not be found in the open market, should be especially designed by the best available American artists. For example, the marble mantelpieces that might be needed would not be ravaged from a Venetian palace, but modeled by the most gifted American sculptors of our day. For my fireplaces, there are already available firebacks designed by Elihu Vedder. If tapestries were required for doors and windows and walls, the cartoons would be entrusted to a mural painter of distinction, with the suggestion that he should avail himself of American themes and of motifs of our native flora and fauna. And the stuffs themselves should be woven on American looms, and the coverings, stamped leather or embroidered textiles, should also be the result of the loving labor of American artisan artists. The furniture also should be American, in harmony with the architecture and therefore inspired more or less by the English models which our forebears brought over with them. But these models would not be baldly imitated. They would serve only as suggestions for the furniture called for by our later-day liking for comfort and even for luxury. If this furniture, found in the marketplace as it might be, or specifically designed as it might have to be, proved to be harmonious with the house it was to help become a home, it would somehow reveal itself as adequately American, even if it avoided all willful effort at needless originality. I have seen in more than one New York clubhouse furniture bold in its lines and yet unobtrusive, fit for social use, wholly unpretentious, not consciously of any period except our own. in the furniture as in all the other adornments of my dream dwelling, and as in the house itself, the artist would feel at liberty to profit by the best that the past has bequeathed to us, but they would not be bound or circumscribed by false fidelity to any of their predecessors. And when this residence for the multimillionaire, which I am not, may arise in actual brick and steel and slate, and when it may find itself roofed at last, finished within and without, and furnished in absolute fitness, it would be a period house, but the period would be now and here, New York in the 20th century. And if it should chance to survive to later centuries, it would show them the best that we can do when we set out to build a house just as the Italian palace survives, the French chateau, and the English manor house. It might not be the equal of any one of these masterpieces of the past, but would be the result of an endeavor akin to that which had called them into being. This dwelling of my daydream is only a cloud-capped tower, and I know that I may not live to see it translated into fact, even for some other homemaker. But as Thoreau assured us, if you had built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. And this is the pleasant task I suggest to someone else. 1917. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Alan R. Tate, Bedford, Massachusetts.
Chapter 4 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Han. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. Chapter 4. What is American Literature? 1. It was in the 9th decade of the 19th century that a British historian of the expansion of the British race proclaimed boldly that permanent unity of the several people who have English for their mother tongue, despite whatever political severance may have taken place. When John Richard Green came to record the revolt of the American colonies from British rule and the establishment of the independence of the United States, he asserted that since 1776, "the life of the English people has flowed not in one current, but in two; and while the older has shown little sign of lessening, the younger has fast risen to a greatness which has changed the face of the world. In wealth and material energy, as in numbers, it far surpasses the mother country from which it sprang. It is already the main branch of the English people, and in the days that are at hand the main current of that people's history must run along the channel, not of the Thames or the Mersey, but of the Hudson and the Mississippi." If an American had penned this eloquent paragraph, he would have laid himself open to the charge of boastfulness; and even when an American merely quotes it, he has the uneasy feeling that he may be indulging in a specimen of that vainglorious "tall talk" which was once unduly prevalent in the juvenile United States. Yet it is well that the facts in the case should be stated thus clearly by a British author of high authority, for these facts are often forgotten, or at least overlooked by other men of letters, both British and American. It is useful, and indeed it is needful, for us all on both sides of the Atlantic to be reminded now and again that the people of the British Isles and the immense majority of the people of the United States come from the same stocks, speak the same language, and possess in common the same literature. By the aid of an association of scholars, mainly British but occasionally American, the long story of the development of English literature in the British Isles has been narrated in detail in the 14 volumes of the Cambridge History. And now there have been added 4 volumes setting forth the far briefer story of its development in the United States. These 4 additional volumes deal exclusively with that subdivision of English literature which is naturally and necessarily known as American literature, but which in spite of its separatist name is none the less an integral part of English literature, not to be omitted from any attempt at a comprehensive survey of the whole. Unfortunately, more than one American historian of the later literature which has come into being in the United States, and more than one British historian of the earlier literature which was born in the British Isles, have chosen to deal with these unequal portions of English literature as though they were each of them self-contained entities in no wise related to one another, thus apparently setting what must be termed American literature in opposition to English literature, of which it is only a subdivision. Yet to detach American literature from English literature is to deny the essential unity of the literature of our language. 2. It ought to be obvious that the literature of any language is one and indivisible. It ought therefore to be indisputable that no book of recognized literary merit, no book in which we discover the twin qualities of style and of substance, can fairly be omitted from any complete consideration of the literature of the language in which it was composed, regardless of the nativity or the citizenship of its author or of any political separation which may have taken place between the several peoples who possess that language in common. It is an unfortunate fact, however, that now and again we do find American books and American authors omitted from histories of English literature, although we fail to find any corresponding exclusion in the histories of any other literature, even when the circumstances seem to be similar, not to say identical. For example, no historian of Greek literature has ever ventured to pass over Theocritus, although that Syracusan idyllist owned no allegiance to any Greek state, and although he may never have set foot on the soil of Greece; and no historian of French literature has ever hesitated to consider the work and the influence of Madame de Staël, who was Swiss by birth, who was Scandinavian by marriage, and who was long exiled from France. For these historians of Greek and of French literature it was sufficient that Theocritus wrote in Greek and that Madame de Staël wrote in French. The alien Theocritus may be solitary in Greek literature, but the alien Madame de Staël has a host of parallels in French literature. Every historian of the development of literary art in France discusses in turn Saint Francis de Sales, who was a subject of Savoy and who refused to become a Frenchman; the Scot Anthony Hamilton; the Swiss Rousseau; the German Grimm; and the Italian Galliani. When the author of a manual of French literature comes to the 19th century, he pays attention, proportionate to their individual importance, to the writings of the brothers de Maistre, who were born in Savoy; of M. Maurice Maeterlinck, who was born in Belgium; of Louis Frechette, who was born in Canada; and of M. Villers Griffin, who was born in the United States. Moreover, Petit de Jouville and Brunetière were led logically by this inclusion of alien authors who wrote French to the exclusion of French authors who wrote only in Latin, Abelard and Saint Bernard, de Thou, Scaliger, and Casaubon. It is perhaps even more significant that the new library of Spanish authors comprehends only writers of Castilian, including of course those born in the Spanish American republics, and yet excluding the native Spaniards who wrote in Catalan. In spite of the admirable example thus set by these foreign scholars, who recognize the essential unity of the literature of any language, it is not unusual to find British historians of English literature who bestow ample space upon the French poems of Chaucer and the Latin poems of Milton, and yet who deny any consideration to the essays of Emerson, the romances of Hawthorne, and the poetry of Poe and Whitman composed in the English language, the mother tongue of Whitman and Poe, of Hawthorne and Emerson, as it was the mother tongue of Milton and of Chaucer. 3. Probably the explanation of these occasional departures from the precedent accepted as imperative by the historians of every other literature must be sought in the unprecedented relation of the United States to Great Britain. For the first time in the world's history a group of colonies having achieved its independence of the mother country and having organized itself into a separate nation, has gone on its own way and followed its own destiny until at last its population has come to outnumber that of the parent islands 2-1. And this immense increase of the population in the United States has not been derived exclusively from the British Isles, or even from the kindred stocks out of which the British population was originally recruited. As a result of this development and of this divergence the Americans and the British are at once alike and unalike, and perhaps both parties are more acutely conscious of the points of dissimilarity than of the points of similarity. The inhabitants of Great Britain and the inhabitants of the United States know themselves to be the same and yet not the same. They are the same in that the Americans have inherited the language, the laws, and the political ideals which the British had earlier evolved. They are not the same in that the Americans, having governed themselves for now nearly a century and a half, have had to solve their own problems in their own fashion in their own continent, while the British in their group of islands have acquired a mighty empire and have had to confront difficulties very different from those which rose before their former colonists. As a result of these dissimilar necessities, the British and the Americans have developed each in their own direction, and they have grown apart in spite of their retention of a common language and of the common law. They are two great nations, rivals in discovery and invention, rivals in the arts, rivals in commerce and in finance. They are friendly rivals, no doubt, and they do not feel that latent hostility toward each other which they may feel toward those who speak foreign tongues. There has been 100 years of peace between them, and another war is unthinkable. None the less is each of them acutely conscious of its own independent nationality and jealous of its own individuality. It is small wonder, then, that writers on one side of the Atlantic or on the other, lacking in insight into fundamental facts, should sometimes be tempted to segregate American literature and to set it apart by itself. We may even doubt whether the historians of French literature would have been so unhesitatingly cordial to the Swiss and to the Belgian authors who had French for their sole means of communicating with the rest of the world, if Switzerland now surpassed France in population, and if Belgium now exceeded it in power. While the Americans of today are still English in many ways, they are in no wise British, and even the original immigrants, Cavaliers in Virginia and Pilgrims in Massachusetts, right Elizabethans as they were, suffered a sea change speedily and became subdued to what they lived in. Nevertheless, from the very beginning they held fast to their birthright in the English law, in the English language, and in English literature. To these traditions they were ever loyal, and even when they rose against the agents of the British king, they held themselves children of Chaucer, subjects of Shakespeare, heirs of Milton. Even though they dwell under alien skies, with the 1,000 leagues of the western ocean between the broad new land and the old island home of the race, they have always claimed Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton as theirs by heritage, denying any assertion of primogeniture which might disinherit them. They have had a stalwart satisfaction in their ownership of English literature as a whole, and their descendants of today refuse sturdily to be put off with a younger brother's portion. 4. While we Americans have ever gloried in our inheritance of English literature, we have also had a natural pride in our own authors and in that native literature which began tentatively in the 18th century, which revealed itself more amply in the 19th, and which possesses unknown possibilities of expansion in the 20th. When Matthew Arnold suggested to Sainte-Beuve that Lamartine was not an important poet, the wise French critic replied, "He is important to us." Certain American poets and certain American prose masters are important to us Americans, even if we are well aware that they may be less important to our kin across the sea. Though they may fail to prove their ultimate significance when measured by the universal and permanent standards, none the less they have special significance for us, whose struggles they have recorded and whose hopes they have shared. Every race, says Brunetière in his History of French Literature, is the judge and must be the only judge of its own poets. Thus it is that Racine and Lamartine, for example, are justifiably rated far higher by their own countrymen than would be warranted by a truly cosmopolitan examination of their works. To hold the scales even and to weigh the American men of letters one after another with the weights which have international validity is a task as delicate as it is difficult. Yet it is a little less difficult today, even if it is not less delicate, than it was a century ago, when Sydney Smith was asking, "Who reads an American book?" Previous to the appearance of "The Sketch Book of Geoffrey Crayon" and of "The Spy," the accepted belief that a great nation ought to have great poets, and that the United States ought to be endowed at once with a literature commensurate with the expanse of the country, had lured more than one native bard, possessed of aspiration rather than inspiration, into the concoction of ponderous epics, to be read by title only. This was a manifestation of provincialism, of the desire of a locality on the circumference to demand equality with the spot in the center of things. Provincialism may be defined as an uneasy self assertion supported by faith but not justified by works. It was painfully prevalent in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, and it was sharply satirized by Lowell in an often quoted passage of the Fable for Critics. "Why, there's scarcely a huddle of log huts and shanties that has not brought forth its Milton and Dantes. I myself know 10 Byrons, 1 Coleridge, 3 Shelleys. 2 Raphaels, 6 Titians, I think, and 1 Apelles. Leonardo's and Rubens's plenty as lichens, one, but that one is plenty, American Dickens. A whole pack of lambs, any number of Tennysons. In short, if a man has the luck to have any sons, he may feel pretty certain that one out of twain will be some very great person over again. And in these same earlier decades of the last century, there was to be observed by the side of the self-assertion of provincialism the self-abasing attitude of colonialism, of the inability to see our own except through spectacles belonging to British critics. Colonialism may be defined as a timid deference to the opinion of the mother country and as a blank disbelief that anything good can come out of our own. Lowell, though he did not call it by name, could not fail to perceive this colonialism as clearly as he saw the provincialism, and he hit at it in his contemptuous dismissal of the writing that suits each whisper and motion to what will be thought of it over the ocean. 5. Now, at last, in these opening decades of the 20th century, it is possible for native historians of the American branch of English literature to discuss it, if not with absolute detachment, at least dispassionately, avoiding alike the arrogance of provincialism and the humility of colonialism. The task is not easy even now, because the expansion of literature is relatively so recent in the United States that we shall lack yet a while the perspective of time, which is unerring in assigning the exalted positions to the authors of most importance and of most significance. By holding fast to cosmopolitan standards, we may save ourselves any temptation to take a native goose for a swan of Avon, and to liken our mocking birds to the alien nightingale. There is not likely to be any lamentable failure of justice, if the several contributors to a record in the development of English literature here in the United States strive honestly to ascertain the exact position of our leading authors, first of all in American literature itself, second in English literature as a whole, and thirdly and finally in the larger literature of the world, present and past. 30 years ago the distinguished Spanish scholar who had been representing his native land at Washington paused in New York on his way home and wrote a prefatory note to the American translation of his delightful novel Pepita Jimenez. In this suggestive and stimulating letter of introduction to the American reading public, the Spanish author diplomat took occasion to insist upon the essential unity of the literature of any language, and to dwell upon the necessary recognition of American literature as an integral part of English literature. Yet he paid us the compliment of remarking that we Americans had brought to the common fund of the English-speaking peoples and to the culture of the race rich elements, fine traits of character, and perhaps even higher qualities. He hoped for a favorable reception of his translated tale, because he had observed in this American literature of English origin and language a certain largeness of view, a certain cosmopolitanism and affectionate comprehension of what is foreign, which is as broad as the continent that the Americans inhabit and which forms a contrast to the narrow exclusiveness of the insular British. It must be noted that Don Juan Valera had earlier warned us that it was a delusion of national vanity to believe that there is or ever will be anything that with legitimate and candid independence may be called American literature. And then he made clear his precise meaning. Greece diffused herself throughout the world in flourishing colonies, founded powerful states in Egypt, in Syria, and even in Bactriana, among peoples who, unlike the American Indians, possessed a high civilization of their own. But notwithstanding this dispersion and this political severance from the mother country, the literature of Syracuse, of Antioch, and of Alexandria was as much Greek literature as was the literature of Athens. For the same reason the literature of New York and Boston will continue to be as much English literature as the literature of London and Edinburgh. The literature of Mexico and Buenos Aires will continue to be as much Spanish literature as the literature of Madrid. The literature of Rio Janeiro will be as much Portuguese literature as the literature of Lisbon. Political union may be severed, but between people of the same tongue and of the same race, the ties of spiritual fraternity are indissoluble, so long as their common civilization lasts. There are immortal kings or emperors who reign and rule in America by true divine right, and against whom no Washington or Bolivar shall prevail and from whom no Franklin can snatch the scepter. These tyrants are named Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Camoens. 1916. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. Chapter 5. The Centenary of a Question. 1. It is exactly 100 years ago this month since Sydney Smith asked, "Who reads an American book?" This struck most Americans of 1820 as a most insulting question. It immediately aroused a riot of angry answers from all sorts and conditions of men, and it has unceasingly reverberated through the columns of our literary periodicals in every year of all the 100 since it was originally uttered. But after a century the tumult and the shouting dies, and it ought to be possible for an American of 1920 to consider this famous query with disinterestedness if not with detachment. It may even be profitable, now that there have been more than 50 years of peace between us and our kin across the sea, to consider this query calmly in order to discover all the circumstances of its asking, and even to inquire honestly whether there may not have been at least a little justification for it. Sydney Smith edited the first number of the Edinburgh Review in 1802. He had proposed this periodical as an organ for the group of young men who were keenly dissatisfied with the complacent Toryism which defended a heterogeny of old abuses, and he continued to be a constant contributor to its liberalizing pages for a quarter of a century, in spite of his exile to a remote Yorkshire parish. So vigorous were the assaults of the Edinburgh on these abuses that the Quarterly Review was soon founded by the stern and unbending Tories in order that "the Whig dog should not have the best of it," to borrow Dr. Johnson's characteristic phrase. From its beginning the Quarterly took a most offensive attitude toward America, and often exploded in violent vituperation; and from its beginning the Edinburgh had been far more friendly toward us, as might have been expected from a review started by young and ardent reformers who could not fail to recognize that many of the political improvements they were advocating in Great Britain had already been obtained in the United States. In the Edinburgh Review for January, 1920, there is a criticism of Adam Siebert's Statistical Annals of the United States, published in Philadelphia in 1818. It was unsigned, like all other articles, in accord with the custom that contributions to periodicals should be anonymous; but we now know it was written by Sydney Smith. It extends to only 11 pages, 10 of which are devoted to an abstract of the mass of facts and figures in Siebert's quarto. The tone of the reviewer was benevolent, and it was with kindly appreciation that he transcribed the record of American expansion and prosperity. It was with brotherly sympathy that he warned us that the inevitable consequences of a nation's fondness for martial glory are taxes upon every article which enters into the mouth, or covers the back, or is placed under foot; taxes upon everything which it is pleasant to see, hear, feel, smell, or taste; taxes on everything on earth, and the waters under the earth. It is not too much to say that the friendliness of the first 10 pages of this criticism is really remarkable when we recall that it was written less than 5 years after the termination of what we call the War of 1812, and after the defeat of the British in the battle of New Orleans. Only on the 11th and last page of Sydney Smith's paper could the most thin-skinned of perfervid patriots find anything in any way offensive to our national susceptibility. The sting was in the tail of it, in the concluding paragraphs wherein we Americans were warned not to allow ourselves to be persuaded by orators or newspapers into the belief that we were "the greatest, the most refined, the most enlightened, and the most moral people on earth," and in which we were told that the effect of this journalistic boasting upon a European was "unspeakably ludicrous;" for although "the Americans are a brave, industrious, and acute people," they had hitherto given no indications of genius. This general statement was almost immediately supported by the specific allegation that during our 40 years of independence we had done absolutely nothing for the sciences, for the arts, for literature, or even for the statesman-like studies of politics or political economy. Then Sydney Smith called the bead roll of the orators, scientists, theologians, scholars, poets, actors, and artists who had illuminated the same 20 years in Great Britain, whereupon he asked if there were American parallels to these British worthies. This inquiry was followed by that rattling volley of pointed questions which has come echoing down the corridors of time. In the 4 quarters of the globe who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue? What does the world yet owe to American physicians or surgeons? What new substances have their chemists discovered, or what old ones have they analyzed? What new constellations have been discovered by the telescopes of Americans? What have they done in mathematics? Who drinks out of American glasses, or eats from American plates, or sleeps in American blankets? And the paper concluded with the remark that Americans would do well to keep clear of superlatives of self-praise until these questions were fairly and favorably answered. 2. If this battery of pertinent queries were to be fired point blank at the Americans of 1920, we should not wince, for we could very well leave to others the finding of full and favorable answers. But when it was discharged in 1820, we were bitterly annoyed. Our national vanity was painfully wounded. That national vanity which was then unduly inflated, because it was distended rather by our ethereal hopes for the future than sustained by our solid accomplishments in the past. We were swollen with pride in what we were going to do. We were uneasily conscious of our manifest destiny, and we were inclined to be vocal in flaunting our virtues, even if we did not actually assert that we were the greatest, the most refined, the most enlightened, and the most moral people on earth. The period of our history from the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 to the year when Sydney Smith punctured our complacency with his saw-toothed interrogatory is not a period upon which we can today look back at with complete satisfaction. It was an epoch of jangling party strife, of occasional rebellion, and of threatened secession. It was an era of geographical expansion and of intermittent prosperity. We were spreading abroad toward the south and the west. We were sending our ships to all the ports of all the 7 seas, and we were beginning to manufacture most of the things we needed. The airy hopes of 100 years ago have been more or less justified in the course of the century, but these early aspirations were only too often expressed in material terms, in the statistics of commerce, in the balance of trade, in dollars and cents. We looked forward to mere bigness of the body politic rather than to true greatness of the soul. It cannot have been on a day very far distant from that of Sydney Smith's question when John Quincy Adams made a speech at New Bedford, in which he reckoned the number of whale ships sailing out of the port and compared it with that of an earlier year, taking this as a type of American success. Lowell, from whom I borrow the illustration, made the apt comment that it is with quite another oil that those far shining lamps of a nation's true glory which burn forever must be filled. It is not by any amount of material splendor or prosperity, but only by moral greatness, by ideas, by works of imagination that a race can conquer the future. Of Carthage, whose merchant fleets furled their sails in every port of the known world, nothing is left but the deeds of Hannibal. But how large is the space occupied in the maps of the soul by little Athens! It was great by the soul, and its vital force is as indestructible as the soul. Now, in 1920, we have good reason to believe that we possess sufficient of this vital force to save our soul, since after drugged and doubting years we came at last into the world war in defense of civilization. But what was our state in 1820? That we possessed this vital force 100 years ago is only a hypothesis, supported by meager evidence. We can't afford to be honest with ourselves today, and if we have the courage to look the fact in the face we must confess that our forefathers of a century ago could not answer Sydney Smith's question fairly and favorably. In fact, one reason why this sharp thrust caused us such acute suffering was that we could not parry it and that it went home. Whatever may be the case, in 1920 there is no denying that in 1820 nobody was going to an American play or looking at an American statue or picture. Our physicians and surgeons had done nothing to relieve human suffering, our astronomers had discovered no new constellations, and our chemists no new substances. It is true that if Sydney Smith had asked for our inventions as well as for our discoveries, we could have put in an answer and called attention to the lightning rod, to the cotton gin and to the steamboat, and even to the torpedo and to the submarine, although none of us could have foreseen to what devilish use these devices would be put in the course of time. And it is true also that we could bring forward the Federalist as a statesmanlike study of politics. But Sydney Smith was not a prophet, and he could not foresee the influence which Alexander Hamilton was to exert upon the founders of the Australian and South African federations. If we continue to be honest, we shall have to admit that our forefathers would have been hard put to find a fair and favorable answer, because the books of American authorship which had been published before he insisted on this exacerbating question, and which are read today by other than professed students of our literary history, are very few indeed. No one of us is now ashamed to acknowledge that he is not familiar with Joel Barlow's Columbiad, or with Timothy Dwight's Conquest of Canaan, those magniloquent epics deliberately composed to supply a mighty nation with poems commensurate with its magnitude. There is the Federalist, but that had served its immediate purpose, and not even here in the United States did anybody suspect that it was to be revered as a permanent storehouse of political wisdom. There was Franklin's Autobiography, but this was not printed from his own manuscript until 1868, although a truncated French translation had been published in Paris in 1791, from which an English version had been made about a score of years later. Irving's Knickerbocker had been published in 1809, but 11 years later it had not yet been republished in England, and although a few copies of it had crossed the Atlantic, Sydney Smith could not be fairly charged with knowledge of its existence. Irving's Sketch Book began to be issued in New York in parts in 1819, but the last of these did not appear until 1820, when the complete book was republished in London, where it was cordially received, the Edinburgh Review for August 1820 containing a most friendly criticism. The first collection of Bryant's poems did not appear until 1821, when Irving was instrumental in arranging for a British edition. And it was also in 1820 that Fenimore Cooper published The Spy, to be followed in the next 5 years by The Pilot and by The Last of the Mohicans. Thus we perceive that when Sydney Smith asked his question, American literature was just about to be born, and that if he had asked it 5 or 10 years later, there would have been no difficulty in supplying the fair and favorable answer. What we need to see clearly is that American literature had not really come into being in 1820, however lustily it was to stretch its infant limbs in the decade immediately following. 3. The first 37 years of our independence, from 1783 to 1820, were years of literary penury, and they stand in startling contrast with the literary wealth which had been accumulated in Great Britain during this period, which was the epoch of romantic revival. It was the era of a fresh outflowering of English poetry, high colored and full blooded, startlingly different from the paler prose which had been the product of the first 3/4 of the 18th century. The Kilmarnock collection of Burns had appeared in 1786, and the lyrical ballads of Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798. Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel had come out in 1805, Coleridge's Christabel in 1806, and Wordsworth's poems in 1807. Byron's Childe Harold began to appear in 1812, Shelley's Queen Mab was issued in 1813, and the poems of Keats were published in 1817. Perhaps Sydney Smith would have been kinder if he had refrained from the infliction of futile anguish upon his American friends, but it ought to be evident now that he had good warrant for the question he asked. It was pointed, but it was also to the point. He may have been ungenerous, but he was not unjust. He may have been moved not by playful malice, but rather by an honest desire to make us see ourselves as others saw us. He may very well have believed himself to be not a foe stabbing at a helpless victim, but a friend wielding a scalpel which would relieve us of the tumor of vainglory. I make this suggestion, irenic rather than ironic, with the more confidence because there is in the very next number of the Edinburgh Review, that for April, 1820, an article which must have been written by Sydney Smith and which testifies to the honest desire of the English liberals to keep on the best terms with the young republic on the far side of the Western Ocean. It is a review of an American book published in Philadelphia in 1819, written by a certain Robert Walsh, otherwise unknown to fame, and entitled "An Appeal from the Judgments of Great Britain respecting the United States of America." I have never seen the book itself, but from Sydney Smith's frequent and abundant quotations, it appears to have been a heated protest against the British writers who were then engaged in virulent disparagement of America. These writers were most of them Tories of the strictest sect, and they vented their venom on us month after month in Black Woods, and quarter after quarter in the Quarterly. What Sydney Smith sought to accomplish in the review of this book was to convince Americans that this malignant torrent flowed only from Tory poems, and that it had never disgraced the pages of the Edinburgh Review. He called attention to the fact that the Edinburgh itself had come in for its portion of the abuse which the author of "An Appeal" seemed to think reserved exclusively for America, and, what is a little remarkable, for being too much her advocate. He insisted that the Edinburgh had spoken far more good of America than ill; that in 9 cases out of 10 where we have mentioned her it has been for praise, and in all that is essential or of serious importance we have spoken nothing but good, while our censures have been wholly confined to matters of inferior note, and generally accompanied with an apology for their existence, and a prediction of their speedy disappearance. He quoted a passage from an article in an early number of the Edinburgh in which the assertion was made that the Americans had shown an abundance of talent, wherever inducements had been held out for its exertion; that their party pamphlets were written with great keenness and spirit; and that their orators frequently displayed a vehemence, correctness, and animation that would win the admiration of any European audience. And in his final paragraph he declared that his article may contain things requiring explanation, and things liable to misconstruction, but nevertheless the spirit in which it is written, however, cannot, we think, be misunderstood. We cannot descend to little cavils and altercations, and have no leisure to maintain a controversy about words and phrases. We have an unfeigned respect for the free people of America, and we mean honestly to pledge ourselves for that of the better part of this country. Surely this is frank and manly and straightforward, as Sydney Smith was himself. Surely there is nothing here to offend the susceptibilities of the most sensitive and most thin-skinned of Americans. On any unprejudiced survey we must exonerate Sydney Smith and the Edinburgh Review of a century ago from any ill will toward the United States and from any sympathy with the Tory attacks upon us. That these assaults were incessant not only in 1820, but for the following 50 years, all Americans are aware. That they did immeasurable mischief is notorious; and it is also probable that they were in part responsible for the occasional dislike of Great Britain, which was unfortunately disclosed when we at last decided to enter the Great War in alliance with the nation with which we had waged the War of Independence and the War of 1812. Bismarck was never shrewder than when he pointed out that every country is held at some time to account for the windows broken by its press; the bill is presented, some day or other, in the form of hostile sentiment in the other country. And this hostile sentiment has often proved itself to be the most potent of those imponderables which Bismarck always valued highly. It is interesting to note that Washington Irving had in effect anticipated this pregnant remark of Bismarck's. In one of the earliest of the numbers in which the Sketch Book begins to appear in 1819, there is a paper entitled "English Writers on America," which opens with a significant sentence: "It is with feelings of deep regret that I observe the literary animosity daily growing up between England and America." That Irving himself had been bitterly aggrieved by the abuse lavished on the United States by the Quarterly Review was shown 2 or 3 years later, after the Sketch Book had established his reputation. He declined an offer of £100 for a contribution to the Quarterly. He was in sore need of money, but he felt that it would be unworthy in him to appear in the pages of a periodical which had shown itself unscrupulously malignant towards his country. While the opening sentence of his friendly essay is significant, as I have pointed out, perhaps a later passage is even more deserving of quotation here. Possessing, as England does, the fountainhead whence the literature of the language flows, how completely is it in her power, and how truly is it her duty, to make it a medium of amiable and magnanimous feeling, a stream where the two nations might meet together and drink in peace and kindness. Should she, however, persist in turning it to waters of bitterness, the time may come when she may repent of her folly. She may look back with regret at her infatuation in repulsing from her side a nation she might have grappled to her bosom, and thus destroying her only chance for real friendship beyond the boundaries of her own dominion. January, 1920. End of chapter 5.